Hello and welcome. We live in unprecedented times. Very rarely have so many different kinds of crises played themselves out at the same time. Nobody quite knows where this geopolitical uncertainty will lead to next. But what we are doing here at the India Today studio at the World Economic Forum in Davos is setting up a very high quality conversation with some of the world's leading experts. There is no way we could have assembled this kind of a panel at the same place at the same time at any other place. I am privileged to welcome at this time, and I'll start from the far corner by introducing Ian Bremmer, one of the world's leading experts on global political risk. He runs the Eurasia Group, so welcome, thank you. Flanking him is Kishore Mahbubani. He's been former president of the United Nations Security Council, top Singapore diplomat, academic. He's been on several of our shows, and we're seeing him in person for the first time. It's great to have you with us. We have Ivana Klimpush, Member of Parliament in Ukraine, Chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Integration of Ukraine to the EU. I want to introduce a special guest joining us on India Today television for the first time, Alexander Stubb, former Prime Minister of Finland, a top expert on the European Union, very respected voice here in Europe. He's the director and professor at the School of Transnational Governance in Florence. He's been finance minister, foreign minister, trade and Europe minister in Finland. Thank you, Mr. Stubb. It's great to have you with us. One of my favorite global commentators, Martin Wolf, chief economics commentator for the Financial Times, widely tracked. Everyone knows him, everyone wants to know what Martin Wolf is saying, so we're delighted that you could join us. Thank you so much. And our very own Samir Saran, he's been lighting quite a few fires. They're calling him a fire starter here in Davos, president of the Observer Research Foundation. Samir, welcome again. I want to start by asking Ian Bremmer, because you look at risk very carefully. Everyone watching at this time, and nobody really knows what happens next, but if I were to say, given the fact that we're now months into the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where do you see this war head militarily, and then we'll talk geopolitically?
Well, it's obviously too early to say what we think the outcome of the war is going to be. The Ukrainians have fought incredibly admirably, and NATO has come together to provide support. Will that continue to be the case in 3 months, in 6 months, in 12 months? Most people that I know at Davos and on this panel believe that this war is not going to end anytime soon. And so I think a level of humility around how uncertain the outcome is going to be is still a smart thing to do. But one thing that I think we can be very clear on is that Europe does feel an existential threat on the basis of this invasion. It is a threat to democracy, is a threat to their territorial integrity. It is the end of the peace dividend. They know they must spend real money on defense and prioritize national security going forward. That we know. The second thing that we know is that the level of decoupling of Russia from the advanced industrial democracies, not from the entire world, not from the democracies in the entire world, Lord knows India, but from the United States and its wealthy allies, that feels to me near complete and effectively permanent. I mean, for the long term, as long as Putin is in charge of Russia, as long as Russia looks like it does today, there is some form of Cold War between Russia and the West. But I think beyond that, there's still an awful lot to recognize that we don't know today.
Martin Wolf, your sense of what could be the next step in this war, where do you think things are heading?
Well, I would be an absolute fool, which I try to avoid, to predict the military outcomes. If Ian isn't prepared to do that, I won't. I think, to me, leaving aside that, this war obviously creates huge economic consequences. It's had big effects on energy prices, coming on top of already important energy price movements. It's creating a real risk and at least worry of a famine, because this is the grain basket, or a grain basket of the world. That will have profound implications for developing countries. I think serious unrest is very likely in important food importing countries and energy importing countries, sometimes the same. And this is in the context of a still very unsettled world economy. The COVID shock is still there. We have exceptional inflation surges. So I think we have to look at this in addition to the tragedy there, the uncertainty about the outcome of the war, and I agree with everything Ian said. It's existential, clearly, for Europe. This is a very big global moment at a time of substantial economic stress, and we don't know how that will play out either.
So let's deal with the economics for a moment, leaving aside the military aspects. There's a lot of talk about the potential of famine. How real do you see the fear being, especially in places like North Africa? And economically, where do you see this war lead to next?
Well, the general rule that all economists have learned basically from the work of a very famous Indian economist, Amartya Sen, is that famine is a policy choice. That is to say, we basically never had a situation when there was generalized food shortages and where anybody, at least in the modern world, the last 100 years or so, has had to starve to death. It's a policy choice. There's certainly enough food. The question is whether, given the prices, and given where the stocks are, the food will be found and moved from the countries that have it to the countries that don't have it. This is a policy choice that has not yet been made. The IMF's managing director has made that very, very clear. I am optimistic, but it's a very big issue, that the wealthier countries of the world, including some very big food producers like Canada, Australia, the United States, and others, will be able to find ways, and Europe is actually very comfortably self-sufficient, to manage this. But it's a question of management. Like the debt crises, we are certainly going to see, given what's happening to the dollar and what's going to happen to interest rates, there is going to be a succession of significant crises in the developing and emerging world. And the question is not whether we can deal with them, there's no question we can, but whether the people will deal with them. And there's one important element in some of them, but not all, and that's China. If we're dealing with a debt crisis, China is now one of the biggest creditors of the developing and emerging world, and cooperation between the West and China on debt is essentially non-existent. So there are policy challenges I see rather than fatalities.
Very few people outside China understand China quite the way that Ambassador Mahbubani does. Looked at from your perspective, where do you see this crisis head next, also possibly from a Chinese point of view?
Well, there's no doubt that the Ukraine war has hit China very badly, and it's been negative for China on at least 4 counts. Number one, President Xi Jinping wanted in the year 2022 calm and stability because it's an important political transition coming up. Instead, he's got to deal with the domestic challenge of ending COVID-19, zero policy, and also dealing with Ukraine. Number two, his number one strategic partner, Russia, has been seriously weakened. That's a loss for China. And number three, President Xi wanted to deal with a separate United States and a separate Europe, but Ukraine has completely consolidated Western solidarity, and so that's a setback geopolitically also for Xi Jinping. And fourthly, of course, I think probably the biggest shock for China was the fact that they thought they had $3.2 trillion of assets in their foreign reserves. Now they realize they can be seized overnight, just like half the central bank reserves of Russia were seized. So you can see how it's been negative for China on several counts. But having said that, I think it's very important to counterbalance the short-term shocks that we are facing with the long-term trends that are happening. And if you do a kind of a long-term trend, for let's say take this decade of 2020s, I can confidently predict that, and I'm going to say this even though I'm not the expert, for the 1.3 billion people in India, for the 1.4 billion people in China, and for the 700 million people in Southeast Asia and ASEAN, this makes it 3.4 billion people, at the end of this decade, they'll be much better off. Because there are profound, deeply instituted policy changes have been put in place to ensure that growth will happen in this region. So let me just conclude with one statistic so you understand what I'm talking about. In the year 2000, the combined economy of ASEAN was 1/8 the size of Japan. Japan's economy was 8 times bigger. Now Japan's economy is only 1.5 times bigger. By 2030, ASEAN's economy will be bigger than Japan's.
Mr. Stubb, from a European point of view, we're seeing greater European consolidation, EU looking more purposeful than it's seemed forever, at least on the outside. How do you see this war play itself out from here on, from an EU and Europe perspective?
Yeah, certainly in the beginning there was an unprecedented unity between the European states, and in many ways the exact opposite happened to what Putin had wanted. You know, Ukraine became European, Europe became united, NATO found its new purpose, Transatlantic Partnership 2.0, and the icing on the cake, of course, Finnish and Swedish NATO membership. But I've been speaking with Ukrainian MPs today, and I'm warning of this sentiment of war fatigue. We're into day 90 of the war now, and the problem here is that our political leaders are not communicating the price of war. And we're pretty much in a situation whereby the focus is soon going to move towards inflation, it's going to move towards higher energy prices, higher food prices, the asylum crisis, and this is going to cause, I think, a lot of unrest in Europe and a conversation on a political level. I predict that this will start sometime around August, September, so this unity is unfortunately going to be a little bit shorter than expected.
You don't think it will stay this way? You don't think this is a new EU which is seeing the risks posed by Russia, possibly moving away from China, at least the countries which seem to be coming into China's grip, now realizing potentially the challenges posed by China?
Sure, to a certain extent. I mean, there's nothing that unites you more than a common enemy, and I guess, you know, Putin has done his best to do that on the European front, and this has revived the transatlantic relationship, and in that sense, taken a little bit away the focus from the US antagonism towards China. But I'm an old enough EU nerd to understand that, you know, the European Union is not a utopia. It's always more than an international organization, less than a state, and there's always going to be bickering. And the more of us we have in the European Union, the more we're going to bicker. And in many ways I say that it always advances in 3 stages. 1 is a crisis, 2 is chaos, and 3 is suboptimal solution. So that's, you know, the EU that we live with.
And that's very interestingly put, and it reflects a bit of what happens back home in India as well on most issues. But Ivana, Mr. Stubb made an important point about fatigue. Everyone here outside of Ukraine wants the war to get over, as do people in Ukraine, but there's a certain sense of growing fatigue about where this ends. When you hear all of this, as a member of parliament, as a representative of the Ukrainian people, what's going through your head? Where do you actually see things go next?
Well, for sure, we Ukrainians do not have the right to be fatigued or tired,
Sure.
because it's not only existential for Europe or for the free world, as far as I believe. It's totally existential for us, because what Russia is trying to do is trying to erase us from the map of the world, so as a nation and as a state. And therefore, for us, it's the only choice to fight till we regain our territories, till we restore our territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence. And there we definitely need this backing from the free nations, which, you know, I would be more optimistic in terms of hoping that there will be finally an understanding in the EU and transatlantic-wise that values are important, specifically when they are defended, and they should not be taken for granted, as several generations of Europeans and Americans have been already thinking of
One
values.
of the themes that we pick up here in Davos is that we're talking so much about war, whereas we should also be talking about peace and what can potentially lead to that peace, and that there isn't enough of a conversation at this moment about how Putin can possibly get off the ramp and how we can find a way of establishing peace.
Well, first and foremost, there is no way for any face-saving exercise for Putin, because Putin doesn't have a face. That's one thing. Secondly, what's important to understand that this war, in order to ensure that there is security after this war is finished, needs to be ended in victory of Ukraine and the free world. And so if that is well understood, that means that we will restore the security in the world, the rule-based order, which is definitely vanishing at this particular moment because of Russian actions, and that we will be able to actually think of the future not only exclusively of Ukrainian peaceful future, but actually much wider, not only region-wise, but also world-wise.
Samir, Ukraine isn't losing, Russia isn't winning. Far from what should happen, tell us, what do you think is most likely to happen next?
I don't know, and I think Ian is right. We all need to be a little humble here. We are in uncharted territory. Firstly, because in the 21st century, violating someone's territorial integrity is unacceptable, should be unacceptable, was not something that most military planners were planning for. So I think this is in some sense a grey swan, because we knew it was coming, and it came. It came faster than we thought it would come. Now, having said that, I think there are three interesting perspectives that have been shared in this particular discussion. The first is on EU and its role going ahead. Can this be the moment when EU really becomes a political, strategic security actor? Or, as the conflict lingers on, will we see a reversal? And will we see back to the old ways? Will we see trade and transactionalism trumping any other value-based framework that EU today believes is fundamental to defend and fight for? I think that's one thing that we need to watch. The second, what about the other votes that were garnered in the first big UNGA vote, 140 odd votes that came? How many of them are going to feel the same a few months from now, 3 months, 6 months? Are we going to poll similar numbers, or are we going to begin to see those outside of the proverbial West really begin to get exasperated by a never-ending family feud? Because some are going to see this as a European problem and are going to begin to get on with their lives, as Kishore mentioned, and that's the third point. Most of Asia sees this decade as important for their transformation. And for us sitting in India as well, I mean, yes, we'll have to steady the boat. We are being buffeted by inflation and challenges around some commodities and energy supplies. But I think there is also an opportunity in this crisis. And I can think of a few. The first, of course, is, can we right-size some of our relationships? This is the moment to reflect. Can we I'm talking about dependencies, all sorts of dependencies, on Russia, on the West, on some other important contributors to our political economy. And I think that right sizing of relationships is one thing. And you mentioned China, but I'm sure most countries are being faced with a few questions that they need to respond to today. And certainly India is going to be engaging with that, or should be engaging with that, in terms of resetting its relationships. That's first. The second, of course, is the economic question. And here I think there is a positive side to it. We are seeing growth and momentum, and we're beginning to see many folks unlock their economic potential in the fourth industrial revolution. But we are also seeing that what was the basis, the undergirding of the fourth industrial revolution may actually be a political arena. For example, technology. Technology is not apolitical. When Uncle Sam decides that we need to cancel Russia, technology companies cancel Russia. And so how safe is the fundamental assumption that our growth based on international platforms is sanguine? And I think that's the second question. And final question that I really want to leave here is, what does it do to the world's approach to China going ahead? Now, is a value-based war only applicable in Europe, or is that a global?
So let me build on that and ask Ian Bremmer whether the war in Ukraine and the impact on Russia increases, in your view, the probability of China going to war on Taiwan, or does it decrease the probability, and why?
Well, I would say that it decreases the possibility, except that I thought the possibility was very, very low before Russia invaded Ukraine. So it's about the same. Why is that? Well, unlike Russia, which is a country that has been in decline, that viewed the Soviet collapse as a humiliation, as a geopolitical debacle, China is not. You've heard this in the panel. China's a country that feels like its future is ahead of it, and it is. And so as a consequence, they have the ability to be strategically patient. Furthermore, this is a tough year for China, not just because of Xi Jinping's third term that needs to be gone through smoothly, but also because the economy is going very badly. Now that they have, this big challenge with Russia, you've heard all of that before. Taiwan is the absolute critical semiconductor producer in the world for China and for others. They're not going to risk that suddenly. Furthermore, if they've learned any lesson from the course of the last 3 months, it's that the West is prepared to respond collectively when there is a crisis, when there is a true challenge. Not 2008 in Georgia, which was marginal. Not 2014 in Ukraine, which was at the margins. But, the Chinese frequently learn from the mistakes of the Russians. When Gorbachev decided to engage in political and economic reform simultaneously, they said, that was a really bad idea. Let's not do that again. And indeed, they haven't. full throttle on economic reforms, no political reform whatsoever, no decentralization. I see exactly that going forward right now. Putin thinking that he has an easy way forward to grab Ukraine and no one's going to respond. You think the Chinese are going to say, let's roll the dice a second time on that one, or they're going to let Putin flail around a bit? I would make a strong bet on the latter.
But that is assuming that there's a rational mind and a rational decision. The reason I say it, for example, if you look at some of the policy choices, just over the past few weeks, the continuing with the zero COVID idea that you can somehow lock the pandemic away, which isn't very clearly the case. And some of Putin's policy choices also, at least outside Moscow, have seemed rather irrational. And so does zero COVID seem at this moment. So is Xi Jinping going to act in a completely rational, strategic way?
Look, on an Indian show, I understand that presuming rationality for the Chinese leadership is not necessarily a common perspective. But to go farther than that, I would say that over the course of the last 3 years, the Chinese government thought, understandably, that their zero COVID policy was working. They were the one economy in the world in the G20 that actually grew in 2020. Furthermore, they were in nightclubs, and their businesses' supply chain was working back when the Europeans, the Americans, the Indians were locking down or couldn't, right? And over the last 2 years, what do they see? 1 million dead in the United States, 1 million dead in Europe, thousands in China. I think that Xi Jinping believes that the Americans and the Europeans have been irresponsible libertines that don't care about their old and their sick. And the Chinese believe that they do. And to say that the Chinese government is irrational because they are willing to take significant economic pain and they're willing to actually throw away some individual liberties to ensure that 1 million don't die, I think that that's a fairly nationalist perspective.
Alexander Stubb, you make this point yesterday in your panel at the World Economic Forum where you said, don't assume that Vladimir Putin is an irrational actor. From a Russian point of view, a lot of what he's doing is the perfectly logical thing to do. Can you try and explain, because looked at from an Indian perspective, some of what Vladimir Putin's been doing looks completely irrational?
Yeah, and probably from a Western perspective as well. But I think we need to look a little bit deeper into Russian history and understand that there was a period of unrest before the 1600s. And that's when the Romanovs came in and stabilized the situation. And the Russian leader has always been supreme, either with God-given rights or class-given rights. And the starting point is that the Russian leader tries to unify Russia. And that is his rationality. He wants to see a historic Russia with one language, one religion, and one leader. And that is what his basis is. He also wants to cement his own legacy. He sees himself as Stalin or Peter the Great. This is his starting point. That's why, for us, it doesn't seem rational, because we ask the question, why is he doing that? And why is he mixing tactics and strategy and making these huge mistakes? But he is in this sort of historical power nostalgia frenzy and can't get out of it. That's why, from his perspective, he's doing the rational thing. Just because we don't think he's rational doesn't mean that he isn't.
Martin Wolf, your sense of what Beijing is picking up from the war in Ukraine, and does it increase Xi Jinping's chances of getting more aggressive with Taiwan? We've got, why I ask this question is also because we've got the People's Liberation Army amassed in our perspective in a completely irrational, illogical fashion against India and refusing to go back.
Well, again, I try not to get involved in discussions on subjects which I don't regard myself as having any expertise upon. I think Ian's analysis is completely convincing. So if they were even borderline sane, they will not invade Taiwan. And I would, if I were having to bet my life on it, I would take very, very long odds against that happening. But if I've learnt anything from my life history, I mean, I've made this point often enough. I was thinking about what Alexander was saying about Putin's motivations. My parents were both refugees from Hitler, who had very similar motivations. So one of the things I believe very, very determinedly is that, by and large, you can assume that from time to time, a psychopath will get into power and will do things that most people would regard as completely unreasonable, because that's the sort of people that tend to get into power. My guess, very strong guess, is that Xi Jinping is not one of them. And therefore I'm reasonably confident that he's not going to do something which would certainly damage China, I think, immensely, quite apart from its damage to the world. So I hope that Mr. Putin is, at least for my lifetime, a one-off in this regard. And I think we all have to pray that. The problem is, and we haven't discussed it, of course, he owns about 4,000 nuclear weapons, and nobody knows what he will do if it becomes obvious that he's going to be beaten. And I share completely the desire for Ukraine to win, absolutely, but the question is, how does Russia lose? I don't see that.
So then where do we go?
I'm happy to leave it to the immensely wise people who run our foreign affairs and our governments to handle this very major mess. But I do think, actually, this is one point I've had this discussion with Kishore, it is in China's interest to help the West in this case. It is in both to help end the war. And she is one of the very, very few people who has the position, the standing, the relationship with Putin to encourage, cajole, influence him in the direction of saying, this is enough. Let's get this over with. Because I do think otherwise I don't see how this is ending.
Kishore Mahbubani, the contra perspective on that is that it suits the Chinese people, Chinese civilization, for Russia to be weakened even further. As a state dependent on Beijing, the weaker Moscow gets, the better it is, and therefore, contrary to what Martin Wolf is suggesting, it actually suits Xi Jinping for this war to go on.
Well, I think the biggest mistake we can all make is to underestimate the Chinese mind. Because the one strategic advantage the Chinese have when they enter into discussions about geopolitics is they never look at this year and next year. They look at the next 10 years, the next 20 years. And they have a very clear idea of where they're heading 10 years, 20 years from now. And they are absolutely certain that they'll become the #1 economy in the world within 10 to 20 years. And they are absolutely certain that when they become the #1 economy in the world, there'll be a reshuffling of the world order. Because countries, in some ways, in a very natural way, fall into place. They acknowledge, okay, there's a new top dog in the room, and we have to work with
Very often it doesn't happen in a bloodless, peaceful fashion.
Yes, exactly. But that's exactly my point about not underestimating the Chinese mind. They also realize that the biggest mistake that China can make is to engage in a war in the next 10 to 20 years. Because they've learned from Sun Tzu, that's a couple of thousand years ago, that the best way to win a war is to not fight it. And that's why they would avoid the use of massive war. And frankly, the big lesson I'm sure they learned from Ukraine is that you can have all the tanks in the world, you can have all the aircraft in the world, you don't necessarily win a war. So at the end of the day, it's in China's interest to have as much stability and order as possible. So if they can find a way of, in some way, bringing about an end to the war, certainly they'll be inclined to do that. But at the same time, a weakened Russia is not in China's interest. Because frankly, if you want to be absolutely cynical, and frankly in geopolitics it's better to be cynical than to be naive and altruistic. If this war in Ukraine drags on for 10 years, and it completely preoccupies Europe and the United States, China will get a free decade, just as it got a free decade after the United States invaded Iraq. I can tell you, I was in the Security Council when the discussions came about whether or not to support the United States invasion of Iraq. In theory, China opposed it. In reality, China was so happy that the United States invaded Iraq. So when it comes to geopolitics, assume that you're dealing with a master chess player with a long-term horizon and that can move and adjust and adapt in a way that many in the country...
You share Kishore's point of view, Samir, because that almost makes it seem like the 10-feet soldiers, they play six-dimensional chess, and that there's no way India or anybody else can outmaneuver them.
No, I think,
but India can outmaneuver them.
I think it's based on a few assumptions, Rahul. First is that Martin's, I call it the Martin threshold. Is Xi Jinping a psychopath or not? I think that's the first test. And if he has similar nostalgic yearnings for the Middle Kingdom, Alex, as clearly someone else does, of Ruski meat. The question is, will that in many ways override the rationality we are attributing to China as an actor? And some would suggest, sitting in this part of the world where we live, Rahul, that we are seeing a degree of irrational aggression from China in more than one space. And I do not want to give a certificate of sanity to Xi Jinping just yet. I think this is a space to watch out for, and it would be to our detriment if we were to give that certificate. We will have to contend with two realities vis-a-vis China. One, China, an economic actor that is going to be overwhelmingly numero uno in the next decade, in the coming decade, and that may be true. But we will also have to contend with our own response to that, which means building our economic resilience, but also building political muscularity to rebuff any adventurism that clearly we have begun to see emerge from Beijing in the last decade. And to pretend that the 2010s did not happen would be insanity. Now, I mean, I want to just make one more point. And I think the Chinese lesson from Ukraine is yet to be learned. Let's not reach a conclusion that the Chinese believe that the 3 months have taught them a lesson. The Chinese play the long game, as Kishore mentioned. In 1 year time, the Chinese may have learned that this is all the response the Europeans could muster. And they may reach a very different conclusion. They may realize that it was all bluster. They are paying in rubles for energy. The political relationships with the rest of the world are fine. Everything has been normalized. Let's make a go for it. So I think the idea that the Chinese have taken any negative lesson as of now may not be valid. And we may have to yet wait it out to know what would be the implications for the business.
As we come to the last part of this conversation, I just want final words, and I'll start with Ivana. You spoke very passionately about Ukraine's desire to win, and most people watching would share that emotion that the people of Ukraine are dealing with an unjust, unfair war, and that ideally Ukraine should win. But in a realistic military sense, how do you think this battle could end, this war could end in a way with Zelensky and the Ukrainian army and people winning?
Well, we definitely very well understand that our courage and our heroism of our armed forces is not enough to win. And even the unity of all the society is not enough to win. Nevertheless, what we are counting on, and that's why we are reaching out to all the nations who can provide us with some backing, is to give us instruments in order to be able to win. And that envisages a couple of things. First is heavy weaponry given to Ukraine so that we can push Russians out from our soil. That's one thing. Secondly, definitely we see the difficulties in holding this unity with sanctions in the EU right now with the 6th package of sanctions. But I think that exactly sanctions should be another leverage of pressure on the Russian Federation. And third, we definitely need the understanding that there is a financial backing for Ukraine in order to be able to just meet the basic needs that are there today. Not to mention, I think that even during this Davos forum here, a lot has been surfacing with regard to potential food crisis. And I would like all of us to understand that food crisis is not because someone has imposed sanctions on Russian Federation, but that is because Russian Federation invaded unjustly, unprovokedly Ukraine. And that means that maybe we can get more nations on board with helping Ukraine to reach to that point to win.
What's your sense, Mr. Stubb, before I end, of whether these sanctions are working as a tool of war? Have economic sanctions done enough damage? And what more should or could the EU be doing to try and put greater pressure on Putin to end the war?
Sanctions are never a magic bullet, but they are an instrument of war. And we've seen 5 waves of sanction coming from the European Union, 6th one on the way. We've seen sanctions from the UK, the US, many other places. We have to understand the base case here, and that is that Russia will be utterly and completely isolated. That means politics, finance, economics, culture, sport, transport, and eventually energy. These just happen step by step. Now, I live in a country with 1,340 kilometers of border. Do I feel comfortable living to the biggest North Korea in the world? No, I don't. But this is the harsh reality and the value-based choice that we have to take in this particular situation. So sanctions are a big part of what's going on. Will they be enough? Never. But without them, we would not be where we are at the moment.
Martin Wolf, your sense on whether the economic sanctions that have been imposed have done enough punitive damage? Do they act as a deterrent? Are they really hurting Putin in the way that they should?
They're certainly hurting Russia, but unfortunately sanctions are always a limited tool, and the particular difficulty here is that because energy prices have risen, and because Russia is an energy exporter and is able to continue to export energy products, oil worldwide and gas to Europe, its actual fiscal revenue from energy exports and its energy export revenue has risen. So we have to recognize, this is why the war is such a difficult challenge for, obviously for Ukraine, but for all its allies, that the tools we have at the moment are only, economic tools are of only modest effect, and that's why the military support and the support for Ukraine directly, financially and so forth, is so crucial. Russia will not be destroyed by our sanctions. The Russian society will be profoundly transformed as a result of Putin's choices.
One of the points made by the International Monetary Fund is the fear of technical recession in certain geographies. Are you concerned that with rising commodity prices, with rising inflation, with interest rates going up, that the whole bounce back on the back of the pandemic is now badly derailed in some geographies, including potentially the US, could definitely see slowing growth and possibly even recession? I
think in the West, in Europe, because of the things you've mentioned, plus the risk of an energy cut-off, which would certainly be very damaging economically, that's just a fact. And in America, because of very high inflation, the tightening which will follow, a very significant slowdown, if not a recession, is probable, and not possible. And the rest of the world will be affected by that for completely different reasons, mainly related to the COVID policy. China's economy is clearly slowing down dramatically. I don't think we'll go into a technical recession, but it's slowing dramatically. That will start bringing commodity prices down, by the way. But yes, we are, I think, very clearly moving into a year, the next 12 months, of very considerable economic slowdown in the major economies of the world.
And which is problematic, Samir, from an Indian perspective, because each time it seemed that corporate taxes being brought down would lead to an investment cycle. The pandemic happened, now the Russia-Ukraine crisis, energy crisis, potentially a food crisis. So everyone's been talking about and waiting for the India story to kickstart, and somehow something happens which is beyond control, which stops that or pushes it back into the future.
Rahul, clearly this is a tough period for economic planners in most parts of the world, and India is no exception. Of course, we have a double imperative of not only sustaining growth, but actually also responding to our development needs. And I think that's the bigger challenge for India, that how does it cater to its SDG goals and objectives in this decade of action, even as it spurs investments and growth. But, you know, I just want to, my final thought on this, I think, I'm not sure the world has been creative enough in its pursuit of peace, as it has been in its implementation of measures to respond to the invasion. And by the way, I'm not in any ways condoning what has happened. I think it must be responded to. But I think we will have to, at some point, knock heads and come up with a framework that allows this conflict to end. And perhaps start thinking about a new multilateral arrangement that will prevent similar situations from arising in other parts of the world. Let us be honest here, what was devised in 1945 is no longer valid, relevant, or even going to stand the test of time in the days ahead. We'll have to rethink multilateralism and the global order, and Ukraine is a wake-up call for all of us to invest in pursuit of peace for the decades ahead.
Let that be a very quick final word. Kishore Mahbubani, do you think the pursuit of peace hasn't been pushed as much as it should or could have? Do you have any diplomatic creative solutions which can potentially create space for peace?
Well, I must say I would agree with Samir that at the end of the day, the war has to end. It's either going to end this year, next year, 5 years, it has to end. And I believe that we should try and end it as quickly as possible, also to save lives in Ukraine. But as you know, Henry Kissinger just said yesterday at the World Economic Forum that it's better for us to work harder to find solutions. And as a diplomat for 33 years, I would say that good diplomacy at the end of the day can find solutions, and it's called what they call creative fudges. And if creative fudges have to help to save lives and end wars, I think we should do it. And I think, by the way, we should continue to use the United Nations. And to be fair, the United Nations did condemn very clearly the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And don't give up on the UN. The UN will always come alive again just when everyone says it's dead and gone.
Europe come alive. Hopefully the UN will also prove it's a body which still serves some purpose in this era. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us. Everybody has really stretched busy schedules at the World Economic Forum, and I'm deeply thankful for you to take out time and join us in this very insightful conversation. Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Kishore. Thank you very much. Thank you.